Hello, Mates Thrive Nation. We're all going to be talking about anxiety with the Anxiety MD, Dr. Russell Kennedy. It's a privilege and a real honor to have him on the show. We've seen mental performance absolutely plummet. Now, 26-year career as a physician and functional medicine doc, I've just never seen the catastrophic effect of anxiety on mental health and mental performance. So it's a really warm welcome to have the Anxiety MD, Dr. Russell Kennedy, on the show.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be able to spread the word.
I do want to talk about anxiety and mental performance. We see a lot of executives, corporate leaders, business leaders, and we're trying to influence as many people as we can. We find these influential people can have a huge impact on the people that work for them and just the influence that they've got. How important is the ability to deal with your anxiety with regards to cognitive performance and mental health?
Well, anxiety probably pulls us out of both the interpersonal realm and the intellectual realm as well, which is what I see with people is their relationships often don't do well. We have this thing called the social engagement system in us. It's eye contact, tone of voice, prosody of voice, body language, facial expression. This is how we interact with other people. Also, when you get into this survival physiology, this state of alarm that I call in the body, it shuts off your rational brain, but it also turns on parts of the brain that are associated with accomplishment. So on some level, we get this sort of mismatch between this high level of hypervigilance but not the same level of performance that we need to be able to dovetail the two together to have optimal performance. So on some level, we need that sympathetic nervous system to activate us. But on the same token, we need that parasympathetic system to kind of balance us out, to be able to be at optimal kind of levels of performance. And what trauma does and what anxiety does is it fires up the sympathetic side, and then it doesn't allow us to kind of lean into that parasympathetic connected side where we're making eye contact, we're close, we're connected, that sort of optimal brain function, which is usually a combination of both sympathetic and parasympathetic activity. So what anxiety does is it pushes you into this very highly activated state, which can be useful on some levels, but at the cost of sort of being connected and being connected to yourself, really. And if you're not connected to yourself, you're not going to have optimal performance.
Brilliant. Now, do you use wearable technology and data like looking at heart rate variability and helping people reduce the anxiety symptoms with the interventions, which I want to talk about later? But do you use any specific data with regards to measuring anxiety?
I don't, because I find it very subjective and there's a lot of interpersonal variation in it. I usually use people's subjective reports of how they're doing. I talk to them like, how's your relationship? How are your relationships doing? Because that's such a key factor that we kind of ignore in anxiety. Because again, when you shut off that sort of eye contact, tone of voice, prosody of voice, facial expressions, body language, when we turn that off, we don't interact with other people as well. We don't get that positive feeling that we need to get to feel human and connected. And if we don't get that positive feeling from other people, we lose that connection within ourselves. Because I often say anxiety is really your adult self separates from your child self. The adult doesn't want to go back to the child because the child holds all their pain. And the child separates from the adult because the adult doesn't really want to help them. So there is this separation there. And it's a separation of your mind from your body as well. So we learn as anxious people to live in this neck up, which can be, we can accomplish a lot, as I was saying, but at what cost is basically what I'm saying, at the cost of your own connection with yourself.
And how does that sort of manifest? I deal with these leaders and I see them as a physician, they're anxious. And I say, I think you've got anxiety. They're like, no, 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 I'm
Yeah.
fine. I can carry on with my work and I'm an executive and I've been doing this for so long and I'm managing and I've got 3-4 hours of sleep and, my performance reviews are so good. How is it that it almost seems it has to come to a breaking point where someone says,
It
oh my
does.
goodness, I've got something. But I think we can be far more proactive and preventative. What would be some of the signs that someone's listening now and saying, hang on, actually, I'm more irritable, but that's actually coming from anxiety. I'm more angry. That's coming from anxiety. I don't have emotional intelligence. That's coming from a root of anxiety in the body. What do you think the telltale signs are that people are probably unaware of out there?
Well, I think you nailed it. I think especially in men, irritability, because irritability kind of it just goes under the radar of anger. Like if you're an angry person at work, it shows up. Everybody kind of knows you as the hothead and the anger. But if you're irritable, you can kind of go in there, you can kind of discharge some of that negative emotion without going into that upper level of anger that everybody starts pointing at, right? So I think irritability is kind of this sort of strange sweet spot in a way, especially for men to be able to discharge some of this alarm that's in your system in a way that's sort of more socially acceptable than overt anger. So I think that irritability piece is we almost condition men to be irritable because we don't allow them to emote very much, and that's another whole conversation as to why men can't emote. But the other thing is we take tears away from boys at such a young age. And my mentor in developmental psychology, Gordon Neufeld, said tears are an adaptive event. So if we don't have access to tears, we keep winding this up. The alarm gets wound up more and more and more. And then we get more and more irritable. And we don't see it as a problem because, as I say, often we can drive that energy into accomplishment and performance. And these people are often very, very uncomfortable when things get quiet. And that's why I ask, my high performers, how are you with quiet? And they're typically not very good.
They're not good. So they
Yeah.
battle with silence and solitude, which I think is one of the most important ancestral practices with regards to a healthy mind and a healthy body. Okay, so if someone's listening out there, one of your biggest, and you've got an incredible Instagram page, we're going to put links there, but one of the biggest things you say in your book and in all your communication, it's not just coping with anxiety. If you're listening out there, it's not with just coping, you're actually healing anxiety. Now,
Mm.
this is fundamentally one of the greatest pillars or one of the greatest foundation in Dr. Russell Kennedy's work is we are talking about healing. We heal many, many different things as physicians, but it seems with mental ill health is, oh no, well, you can just like cope with it and do this to cope with it and, take this pill to cope with it and go for a run to cope with it and, have food to cope with it or alcohol, whatever it is. But you're talking about healing. So what I'd like to hear from you possibly is just a general archetype of a female and a male who's come in with anxiety, the assessment you did, and some basic tenets, because someone's listening out there saying, oh, Dr. Russell, I've heard this before. You know what?
Sure.
I've been coping with this for 20 years. You don't know what I'm going through. I've tried everything and there's no healing to my anxiety.
I think fundamentally, regardless of what sex you are, it's a state of alarm in your body. So a lot of times what I will do with people is say, okay, when you're feeling quote unquote anxious, I don't even like the term anxious or anxiety because I don't think it has a lot of consciousness to it. I think the word alarm has a tremendous amount of consciousness because everybody's been alarmed. If you're out for lunch with someone and you say, hey, I'm feeling really anxious today, they may have no idea what you're talking about. But if you say, I'm feeling really alarmed today, everybody's been alarmed, so they can understand it. So what I will do is I will locate the alarm in your body. So I'll take people to a situation where they would normally feel anxiety, public speaking, or a social dinner or a dinner with the family, like at the holidays. And I'll get them to track their body. It's like, where do you feel that? It's like, oh, well, when my mother starts talking, I start getting this really tight sort of hourglass, hollow feeling in my throat. And I say, well, is it superficial? Is it deep? It's kind of in the middle. Does it have a color or a temperature? I would say it's hot. It feels hot and maybe cold or maybe hot. So sometimes because we're dealing with the unconscious mind and it doesn't deal with specifics, you can feel icy hot and burning, or icy cold and burning hot at the same time.
Yeah.
So I go into where is the alarm in your body? Where does that sit with you? And then once we get that point, we can kind of say, okay, can you put your hand over it? Can you breathe into it? Can you see it? Because often that alarm is a beacon from your younger self who had some kind of trauma or some sort of situation that wasn't resolved when they were younger, and that got repressed or suppressed or whatever Freudian term you want to use down into the body. The body keeps the score, right? So it's finding that area of alarm first, because that area of alarm can be a conduit, a healing conduit between your adult self and your child self. And it can also allow your mind and body to connect, because what we do is we have this uncomfortable alarm in our body. And through interoception, the right hemisphere does not like that feeling. So what I believe happens is when we have this feeling of alarm in our body, is we fire ourselves over into the left hemisphere and start overthinking, over worrying, which in high achievers helps them in a way accomplish, but usually the wheels fall off around 40. So it's one of these things where I find the alarm in people first. And then once we find the alarm and see it as a younger version of us, not to get all woo-woo, because sometimes as an MD and a neuroscientist, when I talk about inner child stuff or younger self stuff, I want to have a seizure. But it is one of those things where it's just finding that alarm is so critical, because that's the root cause of the problem. It's not the thoughts of the mind. The thoughts of the mind are just a reflection. They're just a byproduct of this physiological alarm that's held in the body. I want to say one more thing before, because I know I'm ranting a little bit. So it is mind to body as well. When we think horrible thoughts, it does translate into our body. But what I feel is it probably starts in the body. We're not really aware of it. And then because we can concretize our thoughts, we can describe our thoughts much better than we can describe the alarm in our body. We ascribe the anxiety to these hypervigilant thoughts, when really the hypervigilant thoughts are just a symptom of the anxiety. They're not the root cause. The root cause is this anxiety that's been in your body maybe since you've been 3, 5, 7, 12 years old.
Sure. So if someone's listening now, and I know you said female, male, but you're now healing the anxiety, do you take them through a process of what you've just said now? Where do you feel it? Now, say I've been a doctor of Chinese medicine for many, many years, acupuncturist for many, many years. So I understand somatic experiences and how important it is to treat the body. But would you take them through a process that would just use a hand on that, and that would cause a change in sort of the connection between that body part and the nervous system? Although they're totally connected, there's no real difference between mind and body. They
Right.
one body. I think there's a difference between spirit and body, and everything else is in there. But
Yeah.
But be that as may, so you would use touch, and you would walk them through it through a talk way, or you would use manipulation, visceral manipulation, or hand manipulation. What would be the process to heal? Because I think I've been in the industry so long where it's just cope with your anxiety,
Absolutely.
not heal. And we have to emphasize this. And that's why I recommended your book and your channel, is because of healing. And I think emphasize that through the process of what you would do with someone.
So there's a number of different ways I'll work with people, and typically a lot of it's intuitive. It's really not like a circumscribed way. I was talking to a woman about 6 months ago, and in the middle of the consult, I said, "Who's Rose?" And she said, "Oh, Rose is my grandmother. Rose is the only woman I felt ever loved me." So I do a lot, and I don't sort of put this out a lot, but much of my work is intuitive. Is like I'm able to see inside you. I'm able to see where your anxiety is or your alarm is. And once we see it, we can do something about it. So touch is one of the first things that I do. To say a lot of women will hold their alarm in their throat. A lot of women with a domineering mother or a demanding mother will hold their alarm in their throat, because I feel they wanted to say something to their mother or their father, but they couldn't. So it's stuck there, right? So we'll talk about where this is in your throat and put our hand over it and kind of breathe into it, allow it to be there, embrace it, see it as a younger version of you, like 9-year-old you. Get a picture of yourself. See if you can relate that young picture of you to this sensation of alarm. All this stuff starts to interconnect the unconscious with the conscious, because a lot of our anxiety, alarm, fears come from this unconscious programming that typically happened when we were children. So I try and get into this unconscious realm with them. And we do that by using the feeling state of the body. I often say it's very difficult to treat a thinking issue like anxiety without a feeling state, because anxiety is truly a feeling issue. It's not, the thinking is the symptom. Yeah. Like I said, it's not the underlying cause. So the underlying cause is so the other thing that I will do is I'll say, okay, what was the very best time in your life? And they'll say, well, I remember this time that I went to the fair with my parents. I was like 16. My dad was there. He was still alive. It was great. And I said, okay, where do you feel that in your body? It's like, oh, well, that's kind of in my chest. It's sort of warm. It's kind of yellow. You know, we really dive into it. It's like, okay, well, let's go into that. And now let's go into that feeling in your throat, that pressure, that pain that you had in your throat. And then I titrate. I go back and forth between the two. This is just one of, and I'm shortening it considerably. So touch is one. Titrating back and forth between a very positive, emotional, unconscious past sensation and the current sensation of alarm. I pendulate between the two of them to kind of chop up the alarm, because I think the alarm follows the same neurological pathway every time, right? Well, and I also believe a lot of these alarms are age regressions. So if you see someone losing their mind, they're probably in some kind of age regression, and the amygdala has no sense of time. So when we get stressed, we will tend to go back to that same point in time where the stress occurred. So I had this woman who was in the grocery store, and she heard a mother yelling at her child from the other aisle, and it completely sent her into a panic, because that was basically her childhood. And she freaked out. She left her shopping cart there. She almost got in a car accident on the way to the parking lot. And it was like, yes, because you had turned into that little 8-year-old who was being yelled at by her mother. And I don't think we realize that these panics, these senses of anxiety that we have are often age regressions, but we don't realize that we've tracked back to our 8-year-old self or our 12-year-old self or whatever. And I'm saying, okay, find that 12-year-old sense through that sensation. And now we can actually, as you say, heal it. We can actually go back using that sensation as a beacon for help, as a conduit to that younger version of us, and actually give them what they need. I have this acronym called SHOULD. See, hear, open to, understand, love, and defend. That's what you should have got when you were younger. You should have been seen, heard, open to by your parents, understood by your parents, loved by your parents, and defended by your parents. But a lot of us didn't get that. So now this alarm sensation that we have in our body, we can use that as a portal to giving that to ourselves now.
So that's almost, does it similarly look at sort of internal family systems, that there's a part of you that hasn't developed,
Yep.
or the part of your system that hasn't grown or held on to that trauma? And it could be a part of your body that you stored on a cellular level, what happened, that memory, and it resurfaces, it gets triggered for whatever events in your life.
Absolutely, Steve. It's a very nice synopsis of that. Yeah.
And then do you look at sort of the Chinese medicine principles of like anger in the liver and worry in the spleen,
Yeah.
and how it relates to different areas when you got different symptoms, and how that can cause that alarm? Because I love what you're saying. The thoughts are actually the consequence of what's going on in the
Yes.
body. It's a consequence, and
Yeah.
obviously that consequence then makes the somatic feeling, the body feeling even greater, but it starts in the body.
So I have something I call the alarm anxiety cycle. So it starts in the body with this state of alarm. So the short version is, you have a trauma that's too much for you to bear when you were a child. So you were hit, you were emotionally, physically, sexually abused, you had a great loss, and it wasn't repaired by your parents or caregivers at the time. Or worse, your parents or caregivers were the cause of it.
Hmm.
So that energy that we can't handle as children in our little child mind gets stuffed down into our body. The body keeps the score, and it stays there. And what it does is it creates the anxious thoughts of our mind through this process called interoception. So interoception is when the mind is constantly reading the body. So when it reads this alarm, when that woman was in the grocery store and she heard the screaming, her alarm went up considerably, which fired up a message to her brain about, okay, what am I scared of? What am I scared of in this? And that's why people get these irrational fears of, grocery stores or whatever. When your system is in that high alert, anything that you see in your environment, you will often couple to the anxious pain. And that's why people avoid grocery stores, and they avoid buses. And so this is one of the reasons why we get into these sort of phobic situations. But we have something called the alarm anxiety cycle. So the alarm in the body is the start. It's the root cause. And a lot of people don't understand that it's actually starting in the body. And then the mind, being a meaning-making, make sense machine, has to make sense of that alarm. It has to find out what caused it. So I love the David Goggins quote that says, your mind has a tactical advantage over you. because it knows your worst fears. And as soon as you feel that alarm, it will start bringing up your worst fears. If that's health anxiety, if it's social anxiety, these things will come up. And then the fears themselves, the worries themselves, go and activate the alarm in the body so that we get into this alarm anxiety cycle. So anxiety isn't one thing but two. It's this alarm in the body and the anxious thoughts of the mind. And unfortunately, traditional therapy directs most of their attention towards the symptoms, trying to fix the fever rather than trying to fix the underlying infection, than actually fixing the underlying cause. So what I do is I say, okay, what's the underlying cause? It's this alarm. And when we resolve the alarm by connecting adult self with child self, and there's a bunch of other stuff that I do too, but that's kind of what that's a main point of it, is once we heal the alarm, there's nothing left to feed the anxious thoughts anymore. And on top of that, you regain your cognitive function back, as we were talking at the start of this. So when the alarm drops, we regain our cognitive function, our rational mind comes back, so we can see those worries as completely ridiculous. What happens when we get into real significant anxiety is the survival physiology in our bodies shuts off the rational part of our brain. So one, we make more worries to make sense of this alarm in our body. And two, we shut off the part of our brain that would actually tell us that these worries aren't really real. So we get double whammy. We make more worries, and then we're more likely to believe the worries because the survival physiology of alarm has shut off our rational mind. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, absolutely. It really does. I love the train of thought, and I think a lot of people listening out there are going to need to get a lot of somatic treatments and go through the somatic experiences that they need. I think that's probably part of the missing part of the puzzle for many patients and clients out there. I do want to talk about just an example that I went through in 2021 with my child. She was 5 years old, and we were managing. She got COVID symptoms. And I was managing her well at the practice, but we had a power cut for, I think, about 3 days. We couldn't get any power. I couldn't carry on treating her with all the modalities that I was using. And this little daughter of mine was getting sicker and sicker. And I wasn't able to go to the hospital because I hadn't had the vaccine. So I had to just probably leave her at the front door. And I just remember the one night my body just went into almost shut down. I couldn't sleep. There was, and I'm not an anxious person. I'm just never been like this. But is there a difference between fear and anxiety? And is that a normal response? Eventually, we didn't need to take her and leave her at the hospital, door, which would have been hectic in those times. A little 5-year-old, no parents, and the trauma that I just thought of, the trauma that she would be going through without her parents being allowed in there. But what is the difference between fear and anxiety, firstly? And secondly, a normal adaptive response is you're a parent. Now you're going through all this anxiety. That is a normal process. Should that be then externalized so that it doesn't get stored? Because even as an adult, that could have been stored and then re-triggered later. And that alarm gets stored and that trauma gets stored. And then from then on, you become an anxious person or a person with anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all that stuff. I mean, I wrote down like 5 things I could talk about at this point.
Yeah.
First of all, the difference between fear and anxiety is fear is happening in the moment. So if I am, upstairs in my bedroom and I'm worried I'm going to get hit by a bus tomorrow, that's anxiety. If I'm out on the street and a bus is bearing down on me, that's fear. So fear happens in the moment, and people are remarkably good at dealing with fear. What they're not so good at is dealing with anxiety, because anxiety is self-created. So as I said, or as David Goggins says, the mind has a tactical advantage over you. So when we feel this alarm in our body, our brain makes sense of it by shoving our worst fears in our face, which of course lights up the whole anxiety alarm cycle. And then we get taken over by it. And if this alarm anxiety cycle gets lit up more and more and more, you start developing a chronic sense of anxiety or an anxiety disorder, which I don't typically like the term, but it kind of makes sense. So the difference between fear and anxiety is fear, you'll probably deal with like almost primally, you'll deal with fear. You'll find your way. Anxiety is something you create yourself. So you put the obstacles in your way, but you just don't realize that you're doing it. And because you know your weak points, you put the obstacles in exactly the points where your coping strategies are the least effective.
Okay, great. And then someone like my daughter now, so in the moment I'm fearing, but then she's in the bed. I'm really got a lot of thoughts ruminating the whole night. I'm gonna have to take her to the hospital. I don't want her to be traumatized. What's going to happen to her? I'm not going to be there to protect her and love her. And then 2, 3 days later, it took me like 6 weeks to recover just from that.
Mhm.
Is that a normal process, or what can someone do in that journey to prevent that trauma from getting locked, causing alarm, and then causing anxiety?
Right. Yeah. But first of all, what I would do is you use the term left alone a couple times there. So I would ask you if you and I were working together, I would say, when were you as a child left alone?
Yeah, it's powerful. Yeah, many, many times. My parents were
Yeah.
immigrants and worked very, very hard, and I just had to make it happen and just be responsible before the right age, I think. So to be left alone in a hospital without parents and sort of, the doctors are responsible for my little 5-year-old, that's hectic for me. That's really tough.
Yeah. So what I would do is I would take you back to a couple times when you were left alone as a child or felt alone as a child. And we would go and deal with that. Again, this is dealing with the root cause. It's not sort of saying, well, you could breathe, you could go into the situation, you could understand what's happening. It's not really about that. I mean, I would do that later,
Yeah.
but initially I would go back to say, okay, when were you left alone? Because that's what's just like the woman in the aisle who heard the woman yelling at her child. It's the same thing for us. Like we all have these experiences as a child, and if they weren't repaired at the time, which a lot of them weren't, they stay as very little open wounds in our system, little alarmed open wounds. And then when something like your daughter gets sick and you have this feeling like I have to leave her alone, it reminds you of the time where you were left alone and how helpless you felt. Because your brain is going to scramble to try and make sense of this. And because our brains are impaired, we don't really understand the root cause of it. And we're not really trained to look back, especially in medicine. We're not really trained to look back. We're trained to kind of treat the present day issue. And so much of the present day issue is stuff that's unresolved from the past. Not that everything is freaking inner child trauma wounding. It's not. But there's such a huge run through with almost everything that way that it always benefits you to kind of go back and find that root cause and treat that as opposed to treating the symptoms of today.
Mm. So you'd work on that fact of, not being alone and what happened, and
Yeah.
then the alarm wouldn't be as great, even though that you're sick and I possibly could have left it at the hospital door. My response to that situation or that event would be different because I would be able to navigate myself with regards to the choices that I have.
And the rumination wouldn't be there. Like you wouldn't, because you probably relived that moment a number of times. Like, what if I had to leave her? What would happen? What would have happened if I had to leave her there? I wasn't vaccinated. I would have to leave her. You probably go through that in your mind. Like this is the
Exactly.
tactical advantage, right? So that's not, but your daughter being at the hospital wasn't the root cause of that. The root cause of that was that you were probably left alone too often when you were younger. So I would say to you, I would say, okay, if we had the time, like close your eyes, relax your shoulders, relax your jaw. Think of a time, not the worst time ever, but think of a time when you were left alone by your parents. And let's just sort of scan your body and see if there's an area, an energy, a pressure, a pain, something that kind of, lights up a little bit more in that when you think of that feeling of being left alone, like where would that show up with you?
Hmm.
And then
Yeah.
we would go into that. And is it superficial? Is it deep? Does it have a color? Does it have a temperature? I go into the whole, because there's a part of our brain called the insula or insular cortex in the center of our brain. And it kind of maps our body onto our mind and maps our mind onto our body. So this is when we get, if we get a breakup when we're, a teenager and we get this heartache, the insular cortex is what's mapping that pain onto that area. So if we can find that area, like I said, it's a great conduit to the actual root cause of the problem. So we're talking about root cause healing of anxiety rather than just, medicating it or treating it
Of
with
course.
like breathing techniques or, like tapping. All of those things are great, but they don't actually get at the root cause. The root cause is that adult self, child self separation. Not always, but I would say 90% of the time It's that. And then the people that say, oh, I didn't have any childhood trauma, there's a couple of things from that. One is I will ask them, did you have a separation from your parents when you were before the age of 5? Because 80% of your brain development is before the age of 5. And they all, many of them will come back and say, oh yeah, after my mother gave birth to me, she had a gallbladder issue and she was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Or my parents took my older brother to Disneyland for 2 weeks and left me with, the neighbors or the parents or whatever. So you can have brilliant parents and have this separation. And especially if you're a sensitive child. If you're a sensitive child, sensitive children do not respond well to their parents leaving to go anywhere, let alone go away for 2 weeks. The last thing I will say in that regard is inherited family trauma, which I've seen a number of times. And Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai studies this in Holocaust survivors. The stress that gets transmitted, and we don't know exactly why, it can be methylation of DNA, it can be a bunch of different things, but there definitely is a stress response. If you look at European Jews, their descendants have a much higher anxiety, depression level than, say, the general population. African Americans, same thing. Like, because of their trauma history, it gets passed down genetically and experientially, of course, nature nurture. But we're seeing more and more evidence that there is these sort of biochemical markers, these changes that occur when we get traumatized that we can pass on to our kids.
Sure. And I mean, it probably goes to the fact that if, what you're saying is anxiety or this body not being healed and whole, then absolutely that sperm and that egg, those cells carry some of that trauma or that alarm
Sure.
within, and they're not in a position or the space that they should be. And therefore that new embryo is being affected, I would assume.
Yeah. And I think that often, I think we're seeing our kids now these days, because the environment is so stressful in general for all of us. I think our kids are being born much more sensitive than they would be back in the 1960s. I think we're seeing more autism. We're seeing more sort of stress-related things. We're certainly seeing more anxiety in our children, which is probably because they have a phone-based childhood rather than a play-based childhood. But I think as the society gets more stressed and we get more separate from each other, all anxiety is separation anxiety, and mostly separation from yourself. So as we get more separate as human beings, we're going to see more autism. We're going to see more stress. We're going to see more anxiety in the world. We're going to see more, all of the stuff that leads from that. Alcoholism, drug abuse, all this stuff is a byproduct of this sense of alarm that we're not metabolizing. And if we can learn how to deal with the alarm rather than just try to talk people out of it, talk people, oh, you were emotionally abused. Well, let's talk about that. Let's find, that's fine. Let's see if we can solve that. There is this idea that, if we talk it out, that all of a sudden the puzzle pieces are just going to fit back together. And it doesn't work that way. It's one of the big lies of medicine, psychiatry, psychology, that if you talk about your traumas, that they are going to resolve. And oftentimes when we talk about the traumas, we make them worse. So, we need a radical shift there's nothing wrong with cognitive therapy. Absolutely nothing wrong with talk therapy. But if we only do talk therapy and we don't address the body and the healing of the mind, we're going to be in this situation where people are on medications forever. They're anxious, but they're just coping. And then when something bad happens, they fall off the edge. There's just all this stuff that I can see as a practitioner and kind of like an intuitive that is not good for us as human beings.
So I see that's why probably you became a yoga instructor and you looked at meditation, because it's such a powerful way to connect the spirit and the body. And if I call that spirit, the body, mind, will, emotions, the soul, you're connecting it. And so maybe that disconnect within this own human being of spirit and body, like you said, that separation within ourselves is causing a problem. Then us within community, that separation and isolation is causing a problem. And so you've got these multi-levels of isolation and separation that's causing the alarm in the body.
Which leads to addiction in society, which I think if you ask me, the one biggest issue that's bringing us down as human beings is addiction. And I don't mean like alcohol, cocaine, all that. I mean, addiction to smartphones, addiction to, even television programs, Netflix programs. There is this mass escape that we're all going through. And when we go into our heads like that, we escape the body and we escape this. The only safe place that we have is our body. And what we do as a sort of a poor cousin of that is we go into our mind and we use dopamine kind of instead of like the here and now serotonin. Daniel Lieberman wrote this great book called The Molecule of More about dopamine and how dopamine is kind of taking us over. Anna Lemke also wrote Dopamine Nation. Like dopamine is a form of addiction, and worry is actually a form of addiction too. If you look at worry, what worry does is it takes the uncertain and makes it appear a little more certain. So in our VTA, in our ventral tegmental area of our brain, we fire off this dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, one of the reward centers in our brain. And you go, hey, you're on the right track. You made sense of this. We put a little sugar on it. But basically, the sugar is there that entices us to do it again. But the worry, I might have cancer or whatever it is a huge amount of salt. But it doesn't matter how much salt is there. We keep going back to try and get that little shot of sugar each time, even though we kind of know cognitively there's a big wave of salt coming after it. So it's really the intricacy of the human brain and how it works. When you only relieve pain of anxiety for 0.4 of a second, we'll press that like a rat presses a lever. And especially if we're in an environment where we don't feel connected to others. There is those studies that show that rats in an environment that's enriched have access to cocaine or morphine or whatever for a bar. They might go and touch it every once in a while, but they don't touch it virtually nearly as much as the rats who are in this environment of kind of loneliness. They don't have enough, there's no stimulation in there. They're pressing the cocaine or the opiate until they die. And I think humans are the same. I think we're pressing that worry button until we're kind of, challenging our own existence because it's our minds that are crushing us. It's not that serotonin here and now, peaceful sense that we're watching a sunset. It's like, oh, the sunset would be way better if it was in Hawaii, So there's always this sort of dopaminergic drive, and smartphones are not helping us in this regard for sure.
Sure. Okay, I do want to talk about your mind-body prescription because I think that program online is fundamentally important for people to start this journey. And the three areas that I've got: embracing the mind-body connection. I'd like you to talk about that because someone's listening out there thinking, okay, Dr. Russell, what do I need to do now? Where can I start? You're in Canada, I'm in Africa, although we've got a huge base in the US, 48% of our listeners are there. Unconscious speaker. And then healing from within. Maybe you can just take us through that because we'd like to put links to that. In fact, I'll speak to you afterwards, go through it. And I think it's a good start of the journey. Of course, this is a journey. You're not saying this is a silver bullet. You're saying, let's look at this in a different way. Yes, there's talk therapy and CBT and EMDR and all these things, but let's look at it in a different way. So maybe take us through that mind-body prescription.
Yeah, so it's called your mind-body prescription for permanent anxiety healing. That's the name, or MBRX, as we call it. So I wanted to create a program that was cheap. I think it's like $100 cheaper than a cost of a therapy session. And a lot of my business people say, you should be charging $1,000 for that. It's like, no, I want to get this program out to as many people as I can. So what it does is it really explains what anxiety truly is, which is this state of alarm that's in your body that's probably been there since you were a child. And that's what's driving the thoughts of your mind. So we attribute anxiety to this sense, oh, I'm worrying too much. I'm worrying too much. And we never think of going upstream and find, well, why am I worrying so much? It's because you have this unresolved wound that's stuck in your body that's firing up the worries of your mind. And again, then the worries of your mind fire up that alarm. So you get in this alarm anxiety cycle. So that's first and foremost, understanding that anxiety is not your fault. It's basically you have this energy that's trapped in you that's creating your anxiety. And all the EMDR, all the sort of tapping, all the sort of here and now kind of things that we do are not really going to heal that until we find that version of us, that younger version of us that was left alone or was hurt. Then we can use that sense of alarm, as I say, as a portal into a direct contact with that younger version of us, and then give them see, hear, open to, understand, love, and defend them. And then when we start resolving that alarm, the worries drop because it's the alarm that's driving the worries. So that's the fundamental part of the program that I think most therapists don't understand. And I say, if you finish the program, you will know more about anxiety than 99% of therapists, because most therapists are trained in this cognitive model. They don't even, they rarely even touch the body. As far as they may say, how do you feel about that? But they don't really dive into, okay, where in your body do you feel that? Just like how old are you when you have that feeling? Like, I really track into the younger part of you because I believe that that's where chronic anxiety starts. We all have anxiety. Everyone has anxiety. But if it's every day and it's chronic, there's something in you that's causing it. And it's not just your mind. So MBRX, and then what I do in MBRX is I have these meditations. One of the meditations is to help you find the alarm in your body. So we go through this thing, okay, bring up a stress in your system today, not the worst stress of your life, but a stress. And then slowly I get you focused on, okay, where is that in your body? Where do you feel that? Is it superficial? Is it deep? Does it have a color? Does it have a temperature? All this kind of stuff that I do with my one-on-one people. And then when we find the alarm, then the next meditation is something called the Yoga Nidra. And it takes us through our mind and our body, and it connects our mind to our body in a meditative, hypnotic way. It's about 35 minutes, this one. And then the last three videos, the first three videos are why you're anxious. This is why you're anxious, alarm, the whole alarm. Then the last three videos are ways that your ego is going to sabotage you back into worry. Because we worriers believe unconsciously at a deep level that the worry is keeping us safe. So if I show you something that removes the worries from your life, there's going to be a part of you that starts to freak out a little bit because you have perceived since you were a child probably that these worries are keeping you safe. So I'm going to be seen as taking something away from you that was keeping you safe. And that's the early part of healing from anxiety is often the worst because we believe that the worries are helping us. Like, we know cognitively it's not. We know cognitively it's a bunch of salt and it's not good. But underneath it all, unconsciously, there's a part of us that's really seduced by the fact that these worries appear for 0.4 of a second in the nucleus accumbens to help us. And then sort of the last two videos are, okay, this is how you maintain this. This is how you carry on. And a lot of people will go through the program and you own it. So you go through it like 2 or 3 times. I have people that email me and say, I got it a year ago and I've done it probably 10 times. And it's just really starting to change my life now. Like, it always helped, but it's really become a part of me now, And I think that's what it comes down to is you start realizing where the real source of these worries are. And you start directing your attention towards healing the true root cause, as opposed to just throwing water on symptoms, just, trying to put the fire out. So that's basically what MBRX is about. And I made it $100 because if I make it cheaper, people will buy it, not do it. Mm. If I make it more expensive, it's not available to everybody. So I put it at like $100 because it allows people access to a program that can really change their life. And I think the thing that I'm most proud of with MBRX is that it teaches you how to do it for yourself. Now, if you've had like severe emotional, physical, sexual abuse, MBRX will help you for sure. It'll help you understand, but you'll probably need like a therapist to help you through that. But for most people, even with significant anxiety, when you start realizing that you have control over this situation, that is a time that starts to break the alarms back or breaks the anxiety back because you start feeling in control. The worst thing about anxiety is the uncertainty of when it's going to end. Like, you don't know when it's going to end. So when you have something that you can realize, like, I have agency here, I have some power in here, because when you were a child and you were going through, these alarms, you didn't have power, but we do have power now. And we tend to see ourselves as that powerless child because the amygdala has no sense of time. So when we get anxious, we regress to a time when we have no power. And I think that makes us feel like victims, which of course makes the alarm worse, which makes the anxiety worse. And it just starts the cycle all over again. So we address victim mentality. There's a video in there that addresses victim mentality because that's probably the number one thing that keeps people anxious is once you know the answer, Why aren't you doing it? And it's probably because you've trained yourself to be a victim.
Okay, just as we come to the end of the show, Dr. Russell, that was fantastic. And we'll put the links there and hopefully I can go through it because I always want to go through something if I'm going to recommend it to the community.
Sure.
Let's talk about children. I've got an 8-year-old and how I can help her process things in this world, whether it's using touch or, I've been doing acupuncture for 26 years,
Hmm. Yep.
using injection therapy and ozone and injecting acupuncture points, calling AccuZone and doing a whole bunch of these things
Yep.
using homeopathics and that. Give us a sort of a frame for parents to help their kids. Do they do affirmations and help them process the trauma by touching certain areas or asking the same questions that you've done so that we can help them and defend them, I think, and understand
Yeah.
them at a young age to prevent anxiety later? Because it sounds like you get triggered later, but actually in a child, you were storing that energy, that traumatic energy in your body. So if we can help them release it when they're young, then we can prevent anxiety later.
Totally. There are a lot of studies out that show that combat veterans who have had, unresolved wounds when they were children are much more likely to get combat PTSD than others. So if you have 20 um, soldiers and they all go through the same battle, the ones that had the childhood trauma are like 80% more likely to develop PTSD than the ones that didn't, that had more of a balanced childhood, which makes sense, right? So I think it's with our kids. I mean, the smartphones are a huge deal for sure because we're losing that face-to-face contact. Like when we started today, we started talking about the social engagement system, eye contact, tone of voice, prosody of voice, which is the lilting quality of voice, body language, facial expression. We're losing that with our kids. So around the dinner table, play a game with your kids. Like, what's my face doing right now? It's like, oh, you're happy or you're sad or you're angry. There's something called face yoga, which sounds really flaky, but it's wonderful for kids because it teaches them emotions in a lot of ways. Because there's data out now that people that get a lot of Botox lose their state of feeling in a way, the deeper aspect of feeling, because a lot of being happy is afferent. Like our muscles in our face are smiling, so it tells our brain we're happy. They did studies years ago where they put a pencil in people's mouths and they had them rate things, and they were much more likely to rate them in a happier context when they had the pencil in their mouth. So when we do all this Botox with people, and actors are having a really difficult time with this because they have to emote and they're having a really difficult time accessing these emotions because they paralyze the muscles in their brain that would tell them that they're feeling sad or angry or
Mm.
happy, right? So it's face yoga, I think, for kids. And kids love like things like that, face yoga. Like it's fun. We're losing the face-to-face part of life. I mean, smartphones, kids are going to have smartphones. There's no way around that. But we can have times where there isn't smartphones. We can have time where there's connection because the human brain is wired to connect to faces for sure. Absolutely. So faces are very seductive for children and adults too. So around the dinner table, do a little thing about that. Start teaching kids emotional words is really important. It's been shown that the more emotional words someone knows, the more emotionally intelligent they are, which sounds weird, but it's
Wow.
true. The other thing that I do with kids, or would do with kids, I have two grandkids now who are 7 and 5, is when I put them to bed, if I'm putting them to bed and I get my daughter to do this, is get them a little hot water bottle, put it underneath their kidneys at the back, and then get them this little. You can buy these little eye masks that you can put in the microwave and heat them up, and then put the eye mask on their eyes, and the heat from that, and then sometimes just rub their chest or their back or whatever. Just make that human connection and make them feel safe in their body, because anxiety really is this feeling of not being safe in your body. So the more you can make the kids feel safe, touch is another way of doing it. The more you can make them feel safe and comforted in their body, the more that regulates their nervous system. The more interactive you can be with them, the more they understand emotion, even negative emotion. It's really important to understand it because when I was a kid, we used to play ball hockey from, dawn to dusk pretty much. And if somebody scored the winning goal, like if it was 4-4 and someone scored the winning goal, you could see the elation on their face. You could feel the disappointment if you lost, or the excitement if you won. But our kids aren't getting that anymore. We're not getting that. We're not feeding that social engagement system. And I think that social engagement system so plays into the window of tolerance of emotions. Like if we have a good social engagement system where we've seen people who are in pain, we've seen people who are elated, and we've had a personal experience with that, we've actually felt that, our own window of tolerance increases. But if we just understand things at a sort of a smartphone level, at a surface screen level, of course our kids are going to be anxious. Of course they're going to, be susceptible to all these things. And I think a lot of the gender dysphoria, I think, in kids is just a sense of anxiety, and their brain is trying to make sense of why they feel this way. So I have friends of people, and their teens will sometimes talk to me and say, I'm really concerned that I'm gay. Like I'm really concerned. And it's a real fear for them. And they're anxious. So their brain is kind of looking for a concrete reason why they feel anxious. And they feel anxious because they don't feel connected. And I think a lot of the sort of the gender dysphoria and that sort of stuff is coming from the left hemisphere's, compulsion to make sense of the angst they feel in their body. And one of those things about, being gay is that there's no, absolute saying, there's no blood test that says you're gay or you're not, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the indecision, it's the uncertainty of it that drives them a bit nuts. And then they look for certainty. So it's like, well, I must be gay, or I must be bi, or I must be this. And I have nothing, I have nothing against trans. I have nothing against anything like that. But I think with our kids, they're scrambling to try and make a left brain intellectual reason for this right brain body sensation. And the brain is very powerful. So it will make up things. And then the more you tell yourself something, the more you start to believe it. So this is just a metaphor for, all of us. We're telling ourselves things that just aren't true.
That is absolutely profound. My goodness. To bring order from your left-hand side of your brain. I mean, I just think, and the greater the amplitude of that alarm in the body, the greater the decision or certainty about whether I'm gay or not, to try and counter that very strong alarm that is happening in the body. So now you have to escalate it to bring order and to bring stability and to bring some type of just safety to the system. That is absolutely incredible. Dr. Russell, I do see a guitar in your background. I know we're coming to the end of the show, but I do want to talk about music, because I think vibrational frequencies, how would that help our children, ourselves, with regards to decreasing or processing the body's system and dealing with that alarm?
Yeah, I mean, I think music is one of those things that is primal. We have, that's the other thing is what I neglected to mention is like find the music that kids like to listen to. Like when my grandkids get into my car, they will say, I will say to them, like, okay, what song do we want? What song do you want? And my 4-year-old grandson has taken to I'm Sexy and I Know It. It's 4. And Gangnam Style is another one of his favorites, right? And the other thing that Angus will do is that when we're coming to like the golf course or swimming pool or whatever, he'll say, can we wait until the song's over until we get out of the car? So he's got a real musical ear for sure. And my mother's like that. I was seeing my mother yesterday. She was playing her piano. She's 91. And not doing that well, like slowly kind of declining and that kind of thing too. But it's amazing how well she's not demented, but she's definitely, confused at points. She knows who I am and who her sons are and that kind of thing too, but she's definitely confused. But it's amazing how music, she's able to sort of sit there and do these things. So my mother, when she was 3 years old, went up to the piano and started playing God Save the King. She was born in Glasgow. And they thought, oh, geez. But she's been able, like, especially with like Elton John songs or whatever, she can listen to any song and then just sit down and play it. Wow. Now, at 91, she's not as coordinated as she used to be and that kind of stuff too. But it's always amazed me, her musical talent. And I think music is just one of those things, especially the music that the kids like. themselves. The other thing Angus loves is Yellow Submarine. So like those three things are on repeat when we're in the car, and it lights him up to the point where when he gets out of the car, he is engaged with me, because sometimes he hasn't seen me for a week. So he's engaged with me. He's excited about going golfing or going swimming or whatever. It's amazing what music actually does. And the music that the kids like is so important for them. I think that music is one of those things. Vibration, I think, is one of those things that's just so critical for their development.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. And just want to declare favor and blessing over you. And can you just give your last comment, a message of hope for people listening out there? There's so much despair, discouragement, mental ill health. I've never seen people burn out as much as they ever have in the
Yeah.
corporate arena. Is just a message of hope for people listening.
I think it's really to focus on yourself, focus on what you can change in yourself. There's so much out there. We're getting into this identity politics and all this sort of stuff. There's so much outrage, and it's so easy to be seduced into that, when we blame someone else, we get a dopamine hit in our brain for sure. And I think the way that we fix that is focusing on ourselves, focusing on music, focusing on the stuff that you like. Pay more attention to the stuff that actually makes you feel good, as opposed to being seduced into the vortex of this person likes Trump or that person likes Trump or whatever the conflict du jour is.
Mm.
So easy. Our brains are so seduced by conflict. It's so much healthier to be able to focus on that younger version of you. Like, what did you like when you were a teenager? Did you like riding your bike? Did you box? Did you paint? Like, start doing those things again. Start working from the inside. It's much more helpful and effective to use your body to soothe your mind than it is to try and use your mind to soothe your body. So it's just this internal connection with yourself. That's what we need to focus on. And then when we're connected with ourselves, it's just so much easier to be connected with our friends and our family and the world at large.
Brilliant. And we're going to have all your links of your social, but where can people find you quickly if they're listening now in the car or
The
etc.?
Anxiety MD. That's basically it. It's my website, The Anxiety MD. It's my Instagram, The Anxiety MD. If you type in The Anxiety MD, like I'm all over the internet.
Thank you so much.